on behalf of Cambridge University Russian Society, we are very excited to present Professor Marc Galeotti. He's honorary professor at University College London. He has held incredible positions at New York University, in universities in Prague, and his research focuses really on...
And Keele in the UK. I will always stick up for Keele.
And his research is primarily centred upon Russian politics, Russian security affairs, transnational crime. And I think most interestingly, he is author of many, many books, academic articles, and what is of particular interest to me is his book, We Need to Talk About Putin. Here, Professor Galeotti talks about the need to, I guess, discern Russian politics and to think about it in a better way than it is currently done. Because as I'm sure most of you will agree, Russia is very often mischaracterized in the West. We are presented in a broadly negative fashion, and I think it would be very enlightening to hear what such a established and incredible scholar would like to say on the subject. So please, let's welcome Professor Galeotti. So, as I already mentioned in my very brief introduction, from what I've encountered, from what I've read, from people I've talked to, many people in the West misperceive Russia, and they often see it as simply a reincarnation of the Soviet state. Do you think this is the case? And if so, what do you think are the main characteristics of this misperception?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. Let's be frank. First of all, the Soviet Union was not the Soviet Union as we tended to understand it. There was a huge amount of mythology, and also the Soviet Union in 1922 was very different from the Soviet Union in 1982. So it's a moving target anyway. But I think this really speaks to one of the issues. Look, of course, history matters. I mean, I'm a historian by training, so I'd say that. The culture, the attitudes, the sense of where you fit in the world doesn't just simply reinvent itself because you've got a new flag. But this notion that one can draw these neat lines, that somehow, because Putin once said the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the great geopolitical catastrophes of the 20th century, that somehow you can say, aha, that proves that he would want to bring it back. That proves that really this is nothing less than a slightly sort of foreshortened Soviet Union. Absolutely is not the case. And it's these kind of shorthands which I think, again, get in the way of understanding the extent to which Russia is going through this extraordinary period of transition. And even now that it looks as if it's stuck in a new model authoritarianism, and Putin is working out the constitutional changes which could allow him in a different guise to remain in charge of the system. But nonetheless, I think one of the things that really frustrates me about this, it's just like the Soviet Union, is it's a way of discounting all the very real and usually, in my opinion, positive changes that are taking place. There are just so many different transitions that are going through, economic, political, social, cultural, which make this a different country.
Fascinating. And I think you mentioned that, like you said, like most people don't think correctly about the Soviet Union and they mischaracterize it as well. Why do you think that here we have such a skewed perception of both the Soviet Union and of Russia? Could this be, for example, a result like of the residual logic of Cold War binary thinking of Russia as the perpetual enemy and I guess like normative Western discourses, or perhaps something else?
I mean, there's an element of, look, let's be blunt. How far are our perceptions of most countries based on simple, cheap stereotypes and so forth? It's not just Russia. But in the case of Russia, absolutely, we first of all have this really rich seam of Cold War stereotypes. Particularly the one that really fascinates me is this sense of ruthless efficiency. The Russians are the cold-eyed, chess-playing sort of masterminds. Anyone who knows Russia knows that ruthless efficiency is not necessarily the main characteristic of the Russian state. Ruthless maybe, sometimes efficient. So I think, first of all, we have the Cold War dimension. Secondly, we have the fact that in some ways, look, in the 1990s, basically Russia just simply became a geopolitical afterthought or a source of, wow, bizarre, only in Russia sort of memes and stories. It was where there was, mob violence and PhD students becoming prostitutes because that was their best route to gain money, or whatever the story of the moment was. But it was always that kind of, hey, there's this basket case of a bizarre place called Russia. So in some ways, in a way, no alternative picture of Russia was formed before we had the drift back to confrontation, which after all, one can see it as of the mid-noughts already there. So in some ways, there was nothing to replace it, so they went back to whatever was the last default, which again was the Cold War. And the third element is, we shouldn't make this just something that's happened to poor Russia because of the nasty West. It's also an element in which actually, under Putin, there has been a conscious effort to build Russia's status as a formidable geopolitical player. Whether it's in terms of military deployments, and I'm not just talking about Syria or indeed Ukraine, but things like sending your bombers around along the borders of and then into NATO airspace and all these other kind of things, which is meant to sort of convey this notion that an aggressive military superpower is back. Now, in some ways, this is actually part of a sort of clever geopolitical strategy, because in many ways Russia is vastly weaker than the West, and it's trying to convey strength. But unfortunately, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's a ultimately short-termist strategy, is unfortunately it plays precisely to these Western stereotypes. So you have, ironically, both the West and Russia, in the form of the Kremlin, collaborating to create a certain sort of enemy picture of Russia.
Very interesting. But then, even though we may misperceive Russia broadly, and we may misperceive, I guess, what the Soviet state was like, there would undeniably be some legacy of the Soviet Union. You can't demarcate contemporary Russia from the Soviet state. What, in your opinion, is this legacy? In maybe to summarize it, if that's possible.
Yeah, summarize it. In other words, shut up, Marc. Keep them short. Okay. I think that really I would want to kind of highlight three legacies very briefly, and in some ways they're all about the relationship of state and society. First of all is a notion of the state which places the state above the interests of society as a whole and certainly the law. That actually state power is more important than legality. For all Putin talked about a dictatorship of the law, it's more about dictatorship. Not that this is it's an authoritarianism, not a dictatorship, but it's more about dictatorship than it's about law. So the state is, and its interests are paramount. That's very much something that was kind of codified in the Soviet era, in practice as well as law. Secondly, though, a kind of corollary of that is that Russians assume that the state and the powerful people are going to try and screw them, and therefore they screw back. There is a wonderful tradition of precisely people actually subverting the system to their or their families or their communities' advantage. And this is actually something that, again, I think goes often unremarked, the extent to which actually this is a much more dynamic. Again, part of this, flip back to the sort of vision of the Soviet, is also that the sort of Soviet people, apart from a handful of courageous dissidents, are brainwashed drones marching in lockstep behind the Kremlin's banners. Well, actually, no, that's not how the Soviet people were. It's not how today's Russians are. So there is a sort of a dynamism. So that's the second tradition of sort of the Soviet past that is there. But the third one is this notion of where Russia fits in the world. And again, I think this is, for me, Putin is a perfect example of the sort of transitional generation of leader. He is the last, in my opinion, Homo Sovieticus leaders, not just who were raised in the Soviet era, but had their early career experiences still under Soviet times. So they've got used to the idea of being part of a global superpower, one of the two poles of the world. And I think that is something that Russia is grappling with. And look, come on, we are in Brexit Britain. Britain clearly hasn't quite got over not being an exceptional power. after how many generations? We shouldn't be surprised that the Russians are still going through that transition. But again, I think that notion that Russia as its birthright is a great power is, again, I think, the third sort of the hangovers, I think, from the Soviet era.
How about the pre-Soviet era? What is your take? I know there are many scholars who talk about continuities in political culture that date back from at least the 1500s, whereby there's this relationship between rulers and ruled, where the ruled are, there's a very centralized political structure, and the rulers basically centralize all power within their authority. Do you think that there is a continuity of political culture, or perhaps other legacies of the pre-Soviet or Tsarist eras?
Look, there's always some continuity. I mean, the way that political culture changes, it's a little bit like the way the landscape changes. Over time, tectonic pressures slowly build up mountain ranges, or the elements slowly weather them down, or rivers meander. But it all takes time, and in a way one can usually still see the contours of the previous geography. So, of course, the pre-Soviet legacy is still there. I mean, especially when the Soviets came in, the Bolsheviks came in with this sort of extraordinary tension. I've always felt that really there were two Lenins. There was Lenin, the ruthless and exceedingly effective political pragmatist, who felt that because his dream was so sort of transcendentally wonderful that it deserved, if need be, terrible means to achieve it. And also Lenin, the idealist, who actually had these dreams. And in many ways what happened with the Civil War is that Lenin, the pragmatist, won out, and that wing of Bolshevism, in which winning the war was more important. And one of the ways in which they won the war was precisely by taking on many of the strategies of rule, as well as actually many of the personnel of the old Tsarist state. This was ironically something that Marx had foreseen. He said, try and have a revolution in a country that's not ready for it. You end up with something that sort of has all the energies of revolution, but all the habits and approaches of the old authoritarianism. That was his 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And that's what happened. So, of course, there was a lot of carryover. And also because some of this is not to do with historical tradition, but to do with realities of geography, of climate. That this is a country where you couldn't apply a lot of the agrarian revolutions that are taking place in Europe, that you've got to somehow manage a huge, sprawling state that spans 11 time zones. That in its own way creates recurring similar challenges that you often get recurring similar responses to, not because they're thinking, well, that's how the Tsars did it, but just simply because, well, this is how you can deal with that. So it's a very long-winded and very, very sort of fuzzy answer, worthy of an academic. To try and kind of condense it, yes, there were carryovers, but the point is it was constantly changing. The same way as actually 19th century Tsarism was not post-time of troubles, early Romanov dynasty Tsarism. Things move. So too, we shouldn't have expected a revolution to suddenly wipe all the political culture of Russia and overlay it with a new one.
Thank you. Moving a little bit more to the contemporary Russian state, it's a bit of a jump, but I guess talking more about these legacies, there's been a lot of work about hybrid regimes, about competitive authoritarian regimes, which argues that Russia doesn't fit clearly. I mean, the contemporary Russian regime is neither a democracy nor an authoritarian state. It's this hybrid regime which combines elements of both democracy and authoritarianism. For example, this includes the work of Levitsky and Way in their book on competitive authoritarianism. What is your take on such theories?
I always have a bit of a problem with hybrid. It's the same way as with hybrid war. It tends to mean it's what we call things that don't really fit our models. So, oh, what's hybrid? It means kind of a bit of everything. No, but I mean, obviously there is a lot of truth, because this is not a straightforward dictatorship at all. Yes, Putin himself is the absolute sort of final arbiter of politics. But on the other hand, there is a considerable degree of input, both formal and informal, in the system. And it's not even just simply in terms of elections. I think it's because, frankly, State Duma is not a particularly meaningful body. It's actually reflecting the extent to which there is a lot of practical politics going on in Russia. And again, I think this is one of the stories that I think gets missed, going back to your sort of very first question. I remember I was at an event in London a couple of weeks back where someone, very, I won't say who, but very smart, well informed, said there are no politics in Russia except the politics of the kind of Kremlin clans. The point is, actually, there is this massive, thriving civil society within Russia, as long as everyone observes a certain etiquette. You have to basically pretend that what you're doing is not politics. It's not about the Kremlin. It's not about the big picture. So, for example, we have all kinds of, local environmental movements. We have movements that are agitating for very, very kind of specific local issues. Our school needs to have its roof replaced and the money was allocated and nothing's been done for 3 years and all that kind of stuff. And so long as you don't say, and this is a symptom of the corruption at the heart of this system, or whatever, as long as you just it's just about this one issue, you're allowed to organise, you're allowed to lobby, you're allowed to do all the kinds of things that we expect. And frankly, local officials, part of whose job and part of the metrics by which they're assessed, God, nowadays even Russia has kind of metrics to assess everything, is basically how well you keep people happy. That influences them. And if you mobilise well, and if you manage to get the right number of people sort of on the streets and whatever, then usually something will happen. So again, they're interesting. There are all kinds of spaces for politics and even in a way street democracy, even while the system clearly is not going to accept any direct challenge to its legitimacy or its control. So yeah, I mean, in this respect, fine, let's call it a hybrid system. It is, it is a kind of competitive authoritarianism, but I don't think either of them really fully capture it. I mean, I haven't got an alternative model. I'm not going to pull out and say, aha, we should call it X or Y, because it's not really about competition. It's about a state being willing to allow certain degrees of political mobilization, and actually to genuinely follow, in certain ways, follow what the populace are saying. We know that the most assiduous opinion pollers in Russia, the government, the presidential administration, and they're doing that because, in a way, that is their equivalent of elections, is actually opinion polling.
See, that's really interesting you say that, because you characterise the civil society as quite, I guess, bubbling, if we can use that word. But don't you think that the post-2012 legislation, for example, the legislation against NGOs as foreign agents, or I guess the brutal attack on protesters in Moscow last year, don't you think that's an attempt to stifle civil society? Or
again, I would say it's about reasserting the etiquette. Take NGOs and the whole sort of, and frankly, yes, truly sort of barbaric foreign agent sort of restrictions placed upon them. That's very much geared towards the kind of big, important NGO that is probably involved in national level issues. Because those are the ones, frankly, that are going to get the money from abroad. And there is this great concern that essentially this is Western hybridная война, this is Western hybrid war. How they try and destabilize us is by supporting these things. And in a way, kind of, the Kremlin has a point. If you are a corrupt authoritarian kleptocracy, then foreign support for organizations which fight corruption, which highlight authoritarianism, and which also shine a light on kleptocracy, well, of course they are all destabilizing. But again, this doesn't tend to be used, outside of even within Moscow, but certainly outside of Moscow and in these kind of grassroots movements. Likewise, you talk about the horrible violence that was used against protesters. But the interesting thing was precisely that created a backlash. Yeah, the National Guard went out and they cracked skulls a few times. And then, basically, the regime signalled, no, back away from that. And in part, that was because it was just clearly counterproductive. In part, it was because no one, I think, had really authorised the National Guard to do so. I mean, I'll happily pontificate about the National Guard, and particularly Zolotov, the thoroughly unpleasant man who runs it, for ages, but I'll spare you all that kind of security wonkery. But at the same time, for example, the police were clearly not enthusiastic. It showed tensions within the system. The mayor was backing away from this, Sobyanin. The police were backing away from it. The Kremlin was basically trying to say, quietly, it's nothing to do with us. What this shows is this is a regime which has the capacity, and if need be, the will to use violence, but that's not what it wants to do. It'll do it if it feels it's pushed up, back against the wall, which the protests were not. And in this case, it will actually back away and really look a bit sheepish about this.
That's quite an optimistic.
I am very unfashionably optimistic about Russia in the long term, I would stress.
That's very nice to hear. So do you think civil society has the capacity to make a sizable impact upon politics? Like you said, like in the long run, potentially?
In many ways, look, in terms of, is it ever going to sort of topple the regime? No. This is a regime which absolutely does understand power and has, a variety of instruments and forces able to deploy it. Ultimately, it was a point that Lenin made, that regimes collapse when they have a critical absence of will. And I see no lack of will, unfortunately, in this regime. But what it does is, you might say, it begins to condition the political environment. If you want to have legitimacy, and you're not in a position where you can suddenly shower everyone with money, there are no more Crimeas to be taken. There's no more kind of easy pickings which everyone thinks, yes, absolutely, that's wonderful. Yeah, no one cares about the Donbass, let alone Syria. You need to have some kind of connection with the public. It's one of the reasons why I think Navalny is allowed to continue. It's not that they're afraid of what would happen if they arrested him. It's that actually, well, in the sense of mobs on the streets, they're afraid of what would happen in terms of actually that it sort of gives them even less traction on the public imagination and public legitimacy. I think what it means is this: the elite, who ultimately will end up being, in my opinion, whenever post-Putinism arrives, the elite will be looking to rebuild some kind of legitimacy, because they won't be able to rely on the kind of the heroic model that Putin has developed. And one of the ways is they're going to need to be able to reach out to the public. And so the continuing of civil society is a way of, in a way, getting a public that is used to the idea that it should have a say. One of the most corrosive things for an authoritarian regime is a public that actually believes that it can change things. And if you can change things in very small ways locally, then that keeps that particular spark alive. The best thing from authoritarianism is a lack of hope. Civil society provides small admixtures of hope.
That's interesting. You mentioned elites, and I guess the role of elites, and I think this is a very fitting transition to talk about your book, We Need to Talk About Putin. I think for the audience that's not familiar with the book, would you be able to give a brief summary?
Absolutely, it's fab. Beyond that, look, it's a short book, it's a light book. Read on a long train journey, and particularly the way I approached it is in the thoroughly self-satisfied way of just trying to tackle a whole series of what I felt were the particularly lazy tropes and cliches about Putin as ways of understanding Russia. So the idea of, well, all you need to understand is that Putin was ex-KGB and that tells you everything. Well, it doesn't. The idea that, basically this is an attempt to sort of rebuild the Soviet Union or the Tsarist Empire, well, it's not. So generally, it's a way of trying to understand not just Putin himself, but the Russia over which he presides, by particularly tackling 8 of what I thought were the most annoying of the sort of lazy characterizations.
So then what do you think is, I guess, the key characteristic of his leadership? Because I think we're at about the 20th year, if you don't count the small aberration. What do you think really characterizes his leadership?
This is bear with me, because at first this is going to make me sound like an absolute sort of Putin defender. I think the central element is a kind of patriotism. Now, the problem is, again, this is what I mean about Putin being a transitional figure. It's his notion of what being a Russian patriot means may not be mine, or Alexei Navalny's, or indeed Alexei Kudrin's, for that matter, sort of finance guru. I think that he regards himself as being the man who had to save Russia from, first of all, disintegration, the 1990s. Then he has saved Russia from marginalization, bringing it back to the center of the sort of global affairs. And now he's saving Russia from a Western campaign to subvert and remodel it in the West's interests. Now, this is all very kind of heroic, and I'm sure that is his sort of self-image. And okay, in the process of which he and above all his mates have made huge amounts of money, and he lives a great life and so forth. But I'm sure he genuinely regards that as his historical role. I'm always struck by, again, the Russians have all these different awards, state awards for academics, which is, incidentally, I've always thought a very, very good notion. Most of it he staffs out when people have to be awarded. Historians, because we know history is one of the few things he does read for pleasure. Historians he tends to actually do the award himself. And some friends of mine who were in the history department at Moscow State University were saying, look, he always asks the same question, which is, in 100 years' time, how will they be writing about me? Now, point one, what an awkward question to be asked by the sort of virtual dictator of your country. But secondly, I think it gives us a sense of, where his head is at these days. I think that, but the thing is, for his notion is this, that he has this country which is, he's aware it's ramshackle. He's aware that there's corruption and inefficiency within the elite. His answer is not to institutionalize. His answer is essentially central control. And in a way, all the authoritarian tendencies are because ultimately, I think he does not trust Russians. And that means Russians, from ordinary Russians in the streets up to the people around his own elite. I think there is that sense that you might say he feels that the only way he can bring any kind of positive change is by keeping the reins very tightly in his hands, which is a very, obviously, self-serving perspective, but I think it is a genuine one.
Would you consider this as a kind of ideology, all these factors together? Or is there, so what is your opinion on that?
It's an ideology. It's a tricky one, really, because we think of ideologies, there's a sort of classically in the various kind of isms of something greater than you. I think it's... I've tended to basically divide Putin from early Putin. When he first came to power, frankly, I think he was still in his kind of 1990s mindset, which is amongst other things, make as much money as I can. Clearly he was much more personally venal in his early years. After a certain point, I think that no longer became a factor for him. Issues of power, legitimacy, system sort of survival became crucial. Is this an ideology? Well, although he himself constantly rails against the word nationalism, because I think he associates nationalism with the kind of anti-state nationalisms that you'd find in Chechnya or Tatarstan or whatever. But nonetheless, I would call him a nationalist. If nationalism is truly considered an ideology, yes. But again, when it comes down to it, I think this is much more kind of gut. This is not a thought-through ideology. People who have tried to create philosophies to fit the Putin era. People like kind of this lunatic Dugin, who is sometimes raised as this is Putin's sort of Rasputin figure or whatever. They are instrumentalized. When they are convenient, they are brought to center stage. As soon as they become inconvenient, they're shoved off it, as happened to Dugin very quickly through 2014. So, I mean, I don't think there is any kind of philosophy to it beyond just generally a sort of a gut patriotism/nationalism.
Do you think this absence of a concrete philosophy could be, I guess, a cause explaining why popularity has been declining in recent years? I mean, as indicated by various opinions.
I mean, I've never heard a Russian saying, Putin, he's all very well, but you know, where's his philosophy? No, I mean, I think that, I mean, the decline in his sort of approval ratings and popularity, I mean, it's really for fairly obvious things. I mean, yeah, pretty much everyone was happy to see Crimea as they saw it return to the fold. But essentially, there was a social contract to early Putinism, which was that you stay out of politics, you vote the way you're meant to vote, and so forth. And in return, your life will get steadily better. And you can think that your kids are going to have an even better life than you. And through the noughts, Putin delivered with astonishing success. Now, to a large extent, that wasn't really because of Putin. It was that he was very lucky in terms of the economic circumstances in which he found himself. But nonetheless, you know, basically, you know, despite the 2008 sort of crisis, but you know, broadly speaking, Russians lived better than they had at any point in their life, ever. That counts for something, particularly after the miseries for most people of the 1990s were. That's for quite a while. That's no longer been happening. So I think there is a widespread sense that essentially the social contract was broken. He tried to shift the basis of the legitimation of his regime onto this notion that Russia is a beleaguered fortress and there are enemies all around. I mean, if you look at the often truly toxic stuff that is being said on mainstream Russian television, for example, you know, quite phenomenally rabid. But it's not working. I was the Levada Centre, that is the best of the independent opinion polling agencies still operating in Russia. One of the things it does every year, it does a big survey, and one of the questions it asks is a simple one: do you believe Russia has enemies? And I was fascinated that last year's the score of people who are willing to say yes, Russia has enemies was the lowest we've seen since 2013. So in other words, at a time when, in a way, the tempo of public attempts to influence the public with this propaganda that's very much kind of, you know, everywhere there are enemies and they're trying to undermine us, is ramping up. That's actually, in my opinion, a reaction to failure, because actually the public themselves are thinking, no, it's not. So that legitimating basis isn't working. People just don't care about this notion that there's this sort of terrible threat facing them, and that, you know, their basic civilizational sort of uniqueness of Russia is being challenged. People are saying, actually, well, why can't I afford to go on a package tour to Turkey this year? Why does everything cost that much more, and my salary is lagging behind? And at the same time, that corruption is the Achilles heel of the system. Corruption is the one common experience that unites everyone. Doesn't matter which region you're in, doesn't matter if you're a bus driver or a professor, you've got your own experiences of corruption within the system. It's much more mannered than it used to be. It's not so much kind of predatory corruption of the sort people saying, give me money, but you know that money that should be being spent on other things is being wasted and stolen. And that's something that everyone thinks. So, I think from everyone's point of view, just feeling that Putin is no longer delivering. It's all very well, fine. So it's no longer the 1990s. That's great. 1990s was a long time ago. Politicians rightly should always be asked, yeah, but okay, what are you going to do for me tomorrow? This is one of the reasons why the government is gearing up for a lot of spending, that's going to be coming, precisely to try and basically buy back a degree of legitimacy. Don't think it's going to work in the long term. this is why people are sort of tired. And Putin's been around too long. It's interesting, I was last year, because whenever I'm visiting Russia, if I'm there for any length of time, I try to make sure I don't just stay in Moscow. Because, Moscow, it's great, it's fun, it is not all of Russia. So even if it's just like an overnight somewhere. And I went to Kolomna, just an overnight. Lovely little town, by the way, if you've never been. It's well worth a day trip. And on the Elektrichka train coming back, hearing some, because obviously sort of shamelessly eavesdropping. And for the first time, I actually heard some people were talking about a little bit about politics. And for the first time, I heard Putin described as the old man. And I thought, for someone who so much of his kind of, again, sort of personal narrative that's been projected is about his kind of virility and so forth. When people start calling you the old man, your brand is beginning to get stale.
I think that's really interesting. And I guess on a similar topic, I know that you can't really predict politics, especially, I guess, in the era we live in. But do you have any ideas on what is possible after 2024? I think that's the big question on many people's minds in Russia and beyond.
Look, first of all, my view is that Putin is tired and bored of much of the job. He's actually, frankly, not even doing most of the job. Again, I think this is a problem. Having created this hyper-presidential system, much of, particularly the domestic politics, he's not really interested in. Again, someone I know whose spouse works in the Ministry of Health, who's saying that once upon a time, particularly in his first two presidential terms, Putin was clearly never particularly interested in health policy. But he was dutiful, he would take the meetings, he would always be very well briefed, he would ask good questions. Nowadays, if the Minister of Health wants a one-to-one with Putin, can end up waiting 6 months to get on the schedule. Why? Because it's not interesting. Putin didn't become president to deal with landfill location. He didn't become president to deal with pension reform. I think he is looking for some way out of the day-to-day management of the country. But on the other hand, he's riding a tiger. How can he step down? Rule of law does not really exist, and with all the protections it's entailed. This is not a mafia state. I really don't like that formulation. Although there is a lot of organised crime and the state is often very corrupt. But in some ways he's faced with exactly the same challenge that a mafia godfather has. How do you retire when your security, your wealth, your status, and that of the people close to you all depend on your power? Basically, Putin is in the Godfather 3, which incidentally was the least good of all of the Godfather films. So it says something. I think what he's looking for is precisely trying to create options for himself. I don't think he has a very specific kind of game plan. That's not tends to be how Putin works. He's much more improvisational. He creates alternative options for himself and sees which play out. It's clear that with the new constitutional reforms that the State Council is going to become a much more important and interesting body. We don't know exactly how, because Russians are being asked to vote on the revamp of the State Council before the law is unveiled, which will say what the State Council is. So it's something. It'll be great. Vote for it. One of the routes is a sort of Kazakhstan scenario where he kind of becomes acquires a new role as like kind of father of the nation, as chair of the State Council, with relatively small duties, but can intervene whenever he wants to, and above all has kind of protection. It still means that he's going to need a successor. If he finds that successor, I don't preclude that he would leave before 2024, that he would do just as Yeltsin did. In many ways, Putin is looking for his Putin. Just as he was selected by Yeltsin, his predecessor, and the people around him, as a smart, efficient, but above all loyal successor, he's looking for someone whom he feels he can trust, who's going to be loyal to him in return for being placed in the presidency. If he finds that person, as I said, I think he could stand down early, put this person in as prime minister, so that he, and it probably would be a he, stands with the benefit of incumbency as the acting president, and then he can float off to become his sort of, chairman of the state council or whatever else. But again, it depends on so many variables. It depends on him finding a suitable successor whom he feels he can trust. Putin is not a guy who trusts easily. It depends on exactly what this state council turns out to be. It depends on other kind of circumstances. He will make those choices. But broadly speaking, I think he's looking for his get-out clause. I mean, he's not the kind of person for whom retirement is going to mean going on the international talk circuit and playing pro-am charity golf with other presidents. But on the other hand, he needs to find some way of mediating that. And what will happen after that? Look, I mean, God, who knows? Immediately, obviously, he'll presumably manage his succession unless something happens to him. His successor will, in my opinion, not be one of the current big beasts of the Kremlin, because all of them come with their own power bases. He's going to need someone who's going to be loyal to him. So it's going to be someone at the moment, the same way as, look, 4 years before Putin was president, he was still deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. No one was thinking of him as, that's going to be the next president. So likewise, it's probably going to be, there's a mayor of Omsk or somewhere, who at some point we'll see has been anointed. In the broader scheme of things, though, look, I don't believe this system can operate, even if Putin picks someone who looks like a clone of himself. Oh, God knows, maybe they're currently building a clone of him. The Putin-shaped hole cannot be filled by someone else. I think this is a system which actually is not, in essence, going to sort of last long after Putin hands over. I don't think we're going to suddenly see democracy as we think of it in Western terms, even though that could be anything from Hungary to Sweden, sort of emerging. But I think, what we will see is precisely a transition. The new political generation, they're not Soviet. They're opportunistic, they're kleptocratic, they're cosmopolitan though, they are much more pragmatic, and I think they will have different priorities in terms of rule of law, in terms of relations with the West.
Thank you, that's a very interesting prediction.
Can I actually add one thing about rule of law? Crucial. You can't have democracy without rule of law. You can have rule of law without democracy. But anyway, and that's probably the way it's going to be. You're going to have rule of law first. Why? Well, look, the kleptocrat generation, the ones who stole with both hands in the 1990s, they're beginning to get older. They're beginning to think about their own succession. And just as when you are going to rob a bank, you don't want there to be a police force. By the time you own the bank, you want there to be a police force. So the state does all the protecting for you. Well, likewise, having stolen everything that isn't nailed down, and then stolen the nails, they now want that formalized and legalized. So actually the interesting thing is, and this is something that we're already seeing, sort of sometimes reading between the lines, sometimes not even between the lines. If you look at newspapers like Kommersant and Vedomosti, which kind of reflect more the sort of the both business and political elites, there is a sense that actually we want to have rule of law now. So I think that's going to be the first priority, which means that then maybe the political generation after can think seriously about democracy.
Thank you. Firstly, I would just like to thank Professor Marc Galeotti for I would just like to open. I think we have a little bit of time for some questions. So, if anybody has any questions.
Thank you so much for the talk, first of all. I want to ask about sort of the social values in Russia and to which extent it's affected by the political system. So in Russia, obviously, like LGBT culture is super very like underground. It's literally underground sometimes. And like I've been in Russia before where I've sworn and a man has been like, you shouldn't swear, you're a woman. But these comments or these things here would be sort of unheard of because people who have those opinions sort of, they realize that that's not what they're supposed to say. To which extent is that sort of the opposite in Russia? Is it that people sort of don't feel like the political system legitimizes them to be sort of progressive in their values, or are these sort of conservative tendencies just exemplified, or it's not made bigger or made more acceptable by the political system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing is that the political system has clearly sort of opted to try and mobilise conservatism as one of its sort of bases of support. And so you see the sort of very tight alliance with the Orthodox Church. You see, in part for reasons of demographic crisis, but also others, a renewed emphasis on family values and all these other sorts of things. But the interesting thing is the extent to which actually I think this in many ways is trying to hold back a tide which isn't working. I mean, first of all, obviously it's not just Moscow and St. Petersburg that do actually have quite sort of clearly identified LGBT plus sort of scenes, and it's accepted. Yes, there is a so-called sort of gay propaganda, anti-gay propaganda law, but I mean that's very, very rarely applied, and certainly it's not something that the police want to. I mean, I'm talking to some police officers. This was just shortly after that law was applied, and they were saying, come on, this is not what we're for or whatever. It's not often you turn to your cops for progressive values, but it's clear that this was much more about sort of speaking to a certain kind of cultural base, laws that are passed for the sake of being able to pass laws, rather than something that's really going to play out on the ground. But again, if one actually looks at a long-term tracking of opinion polls and so forth, actually, yeah, it's sawtooth. There's kind of two steps forward, one step back. But generally speaking, the values are modernising, and the younger generation, are less prone. But the point is, look, I mean, I'm an old man. I did my degree at Cambridge 1984 to 1987. And if I think of the kind of values in the UK, which were prevalent then, that was when you actually had a much sharper divide between what we might think of as kind of middle class educated values and the kind of values that you get within a more sort of blue collar population. Much more traditional and so forth. One of the processes that's taken place has not been so much that sort of everyone gets more liberal. It's that actually the gap between these has shrunk quite dramatically in the UK. Yes, there are still sort of differences in values, as we've seen with Brexit and so forth, but actually the gap is vastly smaller than it was way back then in the time of prehistory. I think this is what we're actually beginning to see in Russia. Not that, as it were, the cities are suddenly getting even more liberal. It's that actually we're seeing certainly sort of small town, I wouldn't necessarily say rural, but small town Russia is slowly beginning to catch up. Even in terms of the church, I mean, the church has massive resources thrown at it to push essentially itself on the Russian population. And one of the sort of the heartening things is a slow, what I could think of as a Church of Englandization we're seeing. Church of England, which, is kind of unfairly, people joke about the fact that, people only care about the church in England when it's time to get married, get buried, or send your kids to a church school. And certainly, I was talking to a Russian who was saying, well, actually, there's an element of that that's taking place with orthodoxy, that people are still kind of going, but they're not doing so because they have bought into the values. It's just that there are certain, sometimes career advantages, sometimes other advantages. They're instrumentalizing it rather than anything else. That's, I think, a good thing, in my opinion. So, again, I think, yes, the regime is trying to, but it's actually on a losing bet on that one, I think. I will try and be briefer in my answers so we can get... So anyway, go at the back and then...
So I was interested in the risk calculation of Russian foreign policy decisions, and the question I'm trying to answer is, is there a different tolerance of risk within Russian foreign policy, or in each of those decisions, does the West not understand the way that Russia has mitigated those decisions? So we take Crimea for an example. Was that actually not a risky decision? It was perfectly mitigated to allow the outcome they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And so is your opinion that there is a different approach to risk within Russian foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the deeply disturbing and distressing things at the moment is the extent to which I genuinely feel that the people who are making strategic decisions for Russia consider themselves to be at war with the West, and I mean a war they feel the West started, but nonetheless and obviously when you're at war you have a different set of risk calculuses. And we've seen this particularly with the kind of how they unleash the intelligence agencies and such like. It's more important to not miss an opportunity than to run the risk of something going wrong. Whereas in the West, we're still very much in the other sort of precautionary principle. That said, they are also well aware that the West, certainly when it's united, is much, much stronger. If anything, this is one of the interesting issues that, we always assume that the other guy is 3 meters tall. And just as we have this exaggerated notion of Russia and the extent to which its trolls can sort of totally manipulate our politics and everything else, the fascinating thing is the extent to which actually Russian people in that security world likewise think the West has phenomenal powers. I mean, classic example being Euromaidan in Ukraine. I mean, I'm amazed by these smart, cosmopolitan people I've known, people I've known in some cases for years or decades, who absolutely are certain that there's no way the Ukrainians themselves could have done that. Of course, Euromaidan was made in Langley, Virginia. It was a CIA operation. Though, God bless, I mean, I love the fact that the Russians are still kind of Anglophiles in the sense that they still regard Britain as their most subtle and devious enemy. So I remember I was talking to one kind of moderately barking nationalist, sort of think tank academic-y type, who absolutely was sort of saying about how, of course, Euromaidan was all American, whatever. Then he paused and said, but the Brits probably came up with the idea in the first place. So I mean, I think at this time of Brexit and so forth, my heart goes out to people who still think we matter. But I think they are actually quite risk averse. The point is that they get things wrong because they often misunderstand us. Crimea, frankly, I think Crimea was the lowest of low-hanging fruit. I mean, the Ukrainian state had basically collapsed. The Ukrainian state had for a long time neglected the Crimeans, so and quality of life was much higher sort of in Russia. They assumed, I think, basically that they would face the same sort of thing as with the Georgian War. 6 months of shouty rhetoric and then a reset. So I mean, I was in Moscow for the first 7 months of 2014. So from the sort of pre-Sochi Love Fest days through Crimea, Donbass, and frankly, I think they were probably right. If they hadn't made the mistake of then going into the Donbass, probably by now, there'd be a few sanctions, but we probably would have kind of learned to live with it. The thing is, Crimea was so easy that in some ways I think they were carried through by their own momentum. And again, I mean, at the time it happened, everyone I was speaking to in Moscow was sure, 6 months. Within 6 months, Kiev would have capitulated. The boys that have been brought home, the West will have forgotten all about it. None of that worked. So I think this is it. They are risk averse, but they often get things wrong because they often misunderstand us.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
2 more, because there was a guy there and you, so I will try and be even quicker. Yeah.
Do you think that the extent to which civil society in Russia is currently developed is sufficient to pose a striking challenge to whatever the strategy of the regime will be at the moment of transition?
I mean, I think if you look at how Navalny himself seems to be conceptualizing it, I mean, he doesn't seem to think that he's going to be directly challenging. What he's trying to do is build essentially a party that isn't a party, or doesn't claim to be a party. So that as and when there are at least semi-real elections, he can move. And I think this is the point. Ultimately, civil society, if it tries to pose a direct challenge, will be met by a resistance from a brutal and, in this respect, quite efficient elite. You know, if they want to, they can crush whoever they want to crush. It's more that civil society is kind of mobilized and ready in embryo, so that when, as it were, the elite, for its own reasons, divides, maybe it'll, you know, break apart in sort of internal conflict, decide it needs to hold elections on some more democratic basis. You know, but basically, they are ready to take advantage of it. So I think that's the key thing. If civil society thinks it's going to take on the Kremlin, then that's when Zolotov's boys in the Rosgvardia and so forth are going to be unleashed. And actually, it's going to make the elite band together all the more. They need to sit back and let the elite break themselves and then take advantage. And I think that's really what Navalny is doing.
But don't you think that the introduction of some democratic elements can lead even to a stronger justification of further authoritarianism in Russia?
They love that. But look, the most dangerous time for any authoritarian regime is when it tries to reform. It's the hardest thing to do. And most regimes fail when they do that. But they always think, we've cracked it, we're going to manage to do it, and they don't. It was something, I think it was Napoleon who said, you know, one should never interrupt an enemy when he's making a mistake. And I think that's really what civil society needs to do.
So, as you mentioned, Russia is a huge country, 11 time zones. So, do you think there's a place for true democracy in this country, or it should be autocratic country, just rule this through the whole territory? And so, what's the probability you think that Russia in 100 years' time will become several countries, like, I don't know, like Siberia or Central Russia or something like that?
Gosh, I mean, 100 years' time, I mean, I'm tempted, you know, there's sort of tempted to say, well, of course, you know, hopefully there will be a Chechnya that is independent, for the sake of Russia, quite frankly. I can't help but wonder if China's borders will currently be at the Urals. But no, I mean, look, fundamentally, you know, who knows if this country will hang together. But I think, I mean, there is actually a striking commonality to Russian culture. Sure, if you're in Vladivostok or Khabarovsk or Blagoveshchensk, you know, the money, and there's all kind of reasons why you look to China for practical reasons. But actually, you think of yourself as Russian. And the interesting thing is, if one looks at opinions, it's actually the people precisely in the Russian Far East who are that much more worried about China than the people in the West. You know, I mean, in Moscow, it's, yeah, Chinese tour groups. In the Russian Far East, it's, eek, there's a lot of Chinese there. And Russia knows that it could not possibly fight a war without going nuclear to defend its Far Eastern borders. But I don't see why democracy and a large country necessarily have to be considered antithetical. I think it's one of the excuses that's often used for Russia. Well, we'd love to be democratic, but we're just too big. What it will mean is meaningful federalization. I mean, it is clear that, you know, and that's going to mean a shift of power. You know, and this is one, you know, you look at somewhere like Yakutia, which actually is a huge contributor to the federal funds because it has diamonds. You know, they would rightly say, no, you know, we'd like more of the tax to stay here and so forth. It's going to be this whole no taxation without representation sort of challenge. And that kind of broke British control over, you know, United States. But it's a question of, in a way, how Moscow manages that. But I think, again, it's possible. I couldn't possibly say whether it's likely. It's certainly possible that you could have a democratic Russia which still stretches from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok.
And with that, please join me in thanking Professor Galeotti
Oh, my
for
pleasure.
his insights and this incredible evening. And on behalf of the Russian Society, we have a small gift for you.
Bless you.
Except I just need to retrieve it.
This is a wine for here from Cambridge.
Okay, shut enough to pat, whatever. Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.